Let me start with something most guys in today's world completely overlook. There isn't just one way to understand a woman's interest, and it's definitely not only about what she says. In fact, some of the strongest signals come from subtle, almost invisible behaviors, things many men notice but never truly interpret. And here's the reality. By the time you learn to recognize these signs, you'll realize they were there all along. Let me introduce a scenario. Jason, a 28-year-old marketing specialist living in Chicago, used to think attraction was all about saying the right thing. He spent years trying to improve his conversations, memorizing lines, watching videos, and analyzing texts. But no matter how hard he tried, he kept running into the same confusion. Sometimes a woman seemed interested, but then things faded for no clear reason. One evening, while meeting friends at a rooftop bar downtown, Jason had a conversation that changed how he saw everything. He was talking to Emily, a 26-year-old graphic designer. The conversation was smooth, relaxed, nothing extraordinary. But something felt different. At one point, she tilted her head slightly while listening to him, brushing her hair back from the side of her neck. Jason barely noticed it at first. To him, it seemed like a random gesture. But later, when he reflected on the moment, something clicked. That movement wasn't random. In human behavior, small physical gestures often reveal emotional comfort. When someone subtly exposes more vulnerable areas, like the side of the neck, it can signal trust and ease. It doesn't mean anything dramatic on its own, but it's a piece of a bigger pattern. And that's where most men go wrong. They look for one big sign instead of understanding a collection of small ones. Over the next hour, Jason started paying closer attention. Not in a creepy or forced way, but simply becoming more aware. He noticed that Emily's posture shifted depending on how engaged she felt. When she was interested, she leaned slightly forward. When she got distracted by her phone, her body angled away. This brings us to something important. The way someone positions their body says a lot about their level of comfort and engagement. Think about it. When people feel guarded or unsure, they naturally create distance. They cross their arms, turn slightly away, or place objects between themselves and others. It's not something they consciously decide, it's automatic. But when someone feels relaxed, their posture opens up. Their shoulders drop. Their body faces you more directly. They stop creating those little barriers. Jason started to notice that when Emily was fully engaged in the conversation, her body was naturally oriented toward him. Her movements were more fluid, less defensive. It wasn't exaggerated. It was subtle but consistent. That consistency is what matters. Too many guys look for dramatic signals, when in reality, genuine interest shows up in small, repeated patterns. It's not about one gesture. It's about how those gestures align over time. Later that night, as the group moved through a crowded space, Jason instinctively placed a light hand near Emily's back to guide her through. It wasn't forceful or awkward. Just a natural, respectful gesture in a busy environment. What surprised him was her response. She didn't pull away. In fact, she seemed comfortable with the moment, continuing the conversation as if it were completely natural. That moment taught Jason something he had never fully understood before. Comfort isn't about what you say. It's about how your presence is received. And here's the key. You don't force these moments. You observe them. If someone feels at ease around you, it shows. If they don't, that shows too. Another detail Jason noticed came while they were standing in a group conversation. He glanced down briefly and realized something interesting. Emily's feet were pointed directly toward him, even when others were speaking. Now, this might sound like a small thing, but it's actually one of the most honest indicators of attention. People don't consciously control where their feet point. It's instinctive. When someone is engaged, their body naturally aligns toward what they're focused on. If they're disengaged, their body starts orienting toward an exit, literally. Jason didn't overthink it. He didn't jump to conclusions. But he started to see a pattern forming. And that's the entire point. Understanding attraction isn't about decoding one signal and making assumptions. It's about recognizing a consistent direction of behavior. As the night went on, Jason felt more relaxed. Not because he suddenly became more confident overnight, but because he stopped trying to figure everything out and started paying attention to what was already there. That shift changed everything. He wasn't chasing reactions anymore. He wasn't trying to impress. He was simply present, observing and responding naturally. And ironically, that made him more grounded. Here's what most men miss. When you stop forcing outcomes and start observing reality, you gain clarity. You stop guessing. You stop overanalyzing every word. And you start understanding people on a deeper level. It's not about tricks. It's not about manipulation. It's about awareness. Jason didn't walk away from that night thinking he had figured women out. Instead, he realized something much more valuable. Attraction is often quiet, subtle, and easy to miss if you're too focused on yourself. From that point forward, he changed his approach completely. He stopped asking, "What should I say next?" and started asking, "What is actually happening right now?" That one shift helped him more than years of trying to say the perfect thing. Because at the end of the day, people may say one thing and feel another, but their behavior, their posture, their subtle movements, those rarely lie. And when you learn to notice them, you don't need to guess anymore. Let's take this a step further, because noticing one or two signals is not enough. What really separates a man who understands social dynamics from one who stays confused is his ability to read patterns over time, not just isolated moments. After that night in Chicago, Jason didn't suddenly become a completely different person, but he did start paying attention in a new way. Instead of focusing on what to say next, he focused on how people responded to him in real time. A few weeks later, he found himself on a casual coffee date with someone new, Lauren, a 27-year-old interior designer he met through mutual friends. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in a small cafe near downtown. At first, everything seemed normal. They talked about work, hobbies, travel, nothing out of the ordinary. But Jason was watching something deeper this time. He noticed how Lauren sat across from him. At the beginning, her arms were lightly crossed, and her body was angled slightly toward the window instead of directly at him. It wasn't rejection. It was neutrality. She was still deciding how she felt. Most men would ignore this or misread it completely. Some might even try harder at that moment, talk more, joke more, push for approval. But Jason didn't do that. He stayed calm. As the conversation continued, something slowly shifted. Lauren started uncrossing her arms. Her shoulders relaxed. And without even realizing it, she turned her torso more directly toward him. That's the moment most people miss. Interest doesn't usually appear instantly. It builds. And when it builds, the body follows before the words do. Jason didn't react to it in an obvious way. He didn't point it out or change his behavior suddenly. He simply continued being present, letting the conversation flow naturally. Then came another subtle detail. When Lauren laughed at something he said, she leaned slightly forward, closing the space between them. It wasn't dramatic. It was natural, but it was consistent. And consistency is everything. Here's the truth most men never learn. One signal means nothing, but repeated signals in the same direction mean everything. Later in the conversation, as they stood up to leave, they walked side by side toward the parking area. At one point, Jason lightly placed his hand near the middle of her back as they moved through a narrow doorway. Again, not forced, not planned, just natural awareness of the moment. And just like before, the response mattered more than the action. Lauren didn't tense up. She didn't step away. In fact, she stayed close, continuing the conversation as if nothing unusual had happened. That told Jason something important. Comfort was present. Because here's the reality. People don't need to say they feel comfortable. Their reactions show it immediately. Now let's talk about something even more overlooked. As they stood outside, continuing their conversation for a few more minutes, Jason noticed where Lauren's feet were pointing. Even when she briefly looked at her phone or glanced at the street, her feet stayed oriented toward him. That's not something people consciously control. The human body naturally aligns toward what it's focused on or interested in. It's one of the most honest indicators you can observe. If someone is mentally checking out, their body often follows. Their feet shift toward an exit. Their posture changes. Their attention drifts. But when someone is engaged, even casually, their body tends to stay aligned with you. Jason didn't overanalyze it. He simply added it to the pattern he was observing. And that's the key difference between guessing and understanding. Guessing is emotional. Understanding is observational. Over the next few days, Jason reflected on what he had learned, not in an obsessive way but in a practical one. He realized that for years, He had been ignoring the most obvious information available to him. He had been listening too much and observing too little. Think about how many times you've been in a situation where someone's words confused you. Maybe they said they were busy but something felt off. Maybe they seemed interested, but their behavior didn't match. That confusion usually comes from focusing only on what's said, instead of what's shown. Because words can be controlled, behavior is much harder to fake consistently. Jason also realized something else. These signals don't guarantee anything. They don't mean someone is deeply interested, or that a relationship will form. They simply indicate direction. And that's enough. You don't need certainty. You need clarity. Clarity allows you to respond appropriately instead of reacting emotionally. For example, if someone's behavior shows consistent openness and engagement, you can move forward naturally. But if their behavior shows distance or inconsistency, you don't chase, you step back. That alone saves you months of confusion. A week later, Jason met Lauren again. This time, the dynamic felt even more relaxed. The conversation flowed easier, the body language was more open from the beginning, and there was less need to figure things out. Why? Because Jason wasn't trying to control the outcome anymore. He wasn't performing. He was simply observing, responding, and staying grounded. And ironically, that made him more confident, not because he forced confidence but because he understood what was happening around him. Here's the lesson most men never hear. Attraction isn't something you force. It's something you recognize. You don't create it out of nothing. You notice when it's present and respond accordingly. And when you learn to read these patterns, posture, movement, proximity, consistency, you stop relying on guesswork. You stop chasing mixed signals. You stop wasting time on people who aren't aligned with you. Instead, you move with clarity. Jason didn't become perfect overnight, but he became aware. And awareness changes everything. Because once you start seeing what's really happening, you can't unsee it. And that's when your entire approach to communication and connection begins to shift. Now let's go deeper, because understanding signals is only one part of the equation. The real transformation happens when you learn how to respond to those signals without overreacting, forcing outcomes, or losing your sense of self in the process. A few months after his earlier experiences, Jason found himself in a different setting. A friend's house party in Los Angeles. The environment was louder, more social, and less controlled than a quiet cafe or a one-on-one conversation. This kind of setting is where most men completely lose their awareness. Why? Because there's too much stimulation. Too many people. Too many variables. And instead of observing, they react impulsively. That night, Jason met Olivia, a 25-year-old event coordinator. She was energetic, confident, and naturally social. The kind of person who could talk to anyone in the room without effort. First, their interaction was brief. Just a casual introduction through a mutual friend. Nothing special. But later in the evening, they ended up talking again near the kitchen. Now, here's where things get interesting. Unlike before, Jason didn't jump into trying to impress her. He didn't rush to be funny or overly engaging. He simply stayed present and allowed the interaction to unfold. And as it did, he started noticing familiar patterns. Olivia's posture shifted depending on her level of engagement. When others interrupted or joined the conversation, her body would briefly turn toward them. But within seconds, it would naturally shift back toward Jason. That kind of repeated reorientation is not random. It shows where attention is anchored. At one point, she stepped slightly closer while speaking, reducing the physical distance between them. Again, not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. Most men would completely miss this. Or worse, they would notice it and immediately overreact, trying to escalate too quickly, making the moment awkward. Jason did neither. He stayed steady. That's the difference between awareness and neediness. As the conversation continued, something else became clear. Olivia maintained consistent eye contact, not intense or forced, but natural and relaxed. And when she looked away, she would return her attention just as easily. That flow matters. Because discomfort often shows up as broken attention. Frequent distractions, scanning the room, looking for exits. Comfort shows up as presence. Even in a crowded room. Later, the group moved to the backyard. Music was playing, people were talking in smaller circles, and the atmosphere was more relaxed. Jason and Olivia ended up sitting on a bench, slightly angled toward each other. And this is where another layer of awareness came into play. Jason noticed how she positioned her legs. Not in an exaggerated way, but in a relaxed, open posture that faced toward him rather than away. Again, this isn't about making assumptions. It's about recognizing alignment. When someone is comfortable, their body naturally aligns with the person they're engaged with. When they're not, they create subtle distance. It's that simple. At one point, Olivia laughed and lightly touched Jason's arm for a brief moment. It was quick, natural, and unforced. Now here's where most men mess up. They either ignore it completely or they overinterpret it and try to escalate too fast. Jason did something different. He acknowledged the moment internally, but he didn't change his behavior drastically. He didn't suddenly become more aggressive or overly confident. He stayed consistent, because consistency builds trust. And trust is what allows interactions to develop naturally. As the night went on, Jason realized something important. All of these signals, posture, proximity, attention, small gestures, they were not separate events. They were part of a pattern of comfort and engagement. And that's what matters. Not one signal, not one moment, but the overall direction of behavior. Eventually, as the party started to wind down, Olivia mentioned she was heading out soon. Instead of rushing to secure something or overthinking the situation, Jason kept things simple. He said, "It was great talking with you. We should continue this sometime." Calm, direct, no pressure. She smiled and agreed, suggesting they exchange numbers. Now here's the key point. Jason didn't get that outcome because he said the perfect thing. He got it because he didn't disrupt the natural flow of the interaction. He observed. He stayed grounded. He responded appropriately. That's it. After that night, Jason reflected again, not on what he did right, but on what he didn't do wrong. He didn't chase attention. He didn't force attraction. He didn't ignore the signals in front of him. He simply aligned himself with what was already happening. And that's the lesson most men never learn. You don't create connection by force. You allow it by not interfering with it. Let's be clear about something. None of these behaviors guarantee a specific outcome. People are complex. Situations vary. Context matters. But patterns of comfort, attention, and alignment are consistent across environments. Whether it's a quiet cafe, a busy party, or a casual walk, the same principles apply. Observe how someone positions themselves. Notice how they respond to your presence. Pay attention to consistency over time. And most importantly, stay grounded in yourself. Because the moment you become reactive, you lose clarity. You start chasing signals instead of understanding them. Jason's biggest shift wasn't learning what signals to look for. It was learning how to stay calm when he saw them. That calmness changed everything. Because when you're not desperate for a result, you make better decisions. You communicate more clearly. You become more attractive. Not because you're trying to be, but because you're not trying too hard. And that's what sets you apart. Not tricks. Not lines. Not strategies. But awareness, patience, and control. Once you develop those, you stop guessing. And when you stop guessing, you start moving with confidence, real confidence, not forced behavior. That's when everything begins to change. Now let's bring everything together. Because understanding signals and staying grounded is only valuable if you know how to act on it in a balanced, respectful, and self-aware way. Jason's journey didn't end with a few good conversations or successful interactions. What really changed his life was how he started filtering situations, deciding when to move forward, when to stay neutral, and when to walk away. That's the level most men never reach. A few weeks after meeting Olivia, Jason experienced a completely different situation that tested everything he had learned. He met Megan, a 29-year-old lawyer, at a networking event in New York. She was intelligent, confident, and very direct in her communication. On paper, everything seemed promising. They started talking, and the conversation was engaging at first. Megan asked questions, shared her opinions, and seemed interested. But as the interaction continued, Jason noticed something subtle, but important. Her body wasn't fully aligned with him. Even when she spoke directly to him, her shoulders were slightly angled away. Her feet pointed more toward the open space of the room rather than toward him. And every few minutes her attention drifted elsewhere. Scanning the environment, checking her phone, briefly disengaging. Now, if this had been the old Jason, he would have ignored those signals. He would have tried harder. He would have increased his effort, talking more, asking more questions, trying to win her attention. But this time he didn't. Because now he understood something crucial. Interest doesn't need to be chased. It reveals itself. So instead of pushing forward, Jason adjusted. He matched her level of engagement. He stayed polite, present but not overly invested. And something interesting happened. As he stopped trying to hold the interaction together, Megan either had to lean in or let it fade. And she chose the latter. The conversation slowly lost momentum. And within a few minutes, it ended naturally. No awkwardness. No rejection. Just clarity. And here's the part most men struggle to accept. That was a win. Why? Because Jason didn't waste time trying to force something that wasn't there. He didn't ignore reality. He respected it. That's what awareness gives you, the ability to see things as they are, not as you wish they were. Later that evening, Jason thought about the contrast between Megan and Olivia. With Olivia, the signals were consistent: alignment, engagement, presence. With Megan, the signals were mixed: partial engagement, subtle distance, inconsistent attention. And that difference changed how he responded. That's the entire point of learning this. Not to manipulate outcomes, but to make better decisions. Let's make this practical. When someone is genuinely interested, you won't feel like you're doing all the work. Their behavior will meet you halfway. Their attention will feel natural, not forced. But when interest is low or uncertain, the effort becomes one-sided. And that's where most men make their biggest mistake. They invest more when they receive less. They chase clarity instead of observing it. They try to fix something that isn't broken. It simply isn't aligned. Jason stopped doing that. Instead, he followed a simple principle. Match energy. Don't force it. If someone is open, be open. If someone is engaged, engage. If someone is distant, step back. No drama. No overthinking. Just alignment. A few days later, Jason met Olivia again for a second date. This time the dynamic was even clearer. From the moment they sat down, her body language was relaxed and open. She maintained eye contact, leaned in during conversation, and stayed fully present. There was no confusion. And because there was no confusion, there was no need for Jason to overanalyze anything. He simply enjoyed the moment. That's what clarity feels like. It's calm. It's natural. It doesn't require constant questioning. And here's something important to understand. Clarity is more valuable than validation. Most men chase validation. They want to feel liked, accepted, chosen. But what they actually need is clarity. Because clarity tells you where you stand. And once you know where you stand, you can act accordingly. Jason's biggest transformation wasn't becoming more attractive or more confident in a traditional sense. It was becoming more selective. He stopped trying to connect with everyone. He started recognizing who was already aligned with him. And that changed everything. Because when you only invest in people who show genuine interest, your energy becomes more focused. Your interactions become more meaningful. And your confidence becomes real. Not something you're trying to prove, but something you naturally feel. Let's be clear about one final point. None of this is about perfection. You will still misread situations sometimes. You will still encounter mixed signals. You will still face moments of uncertainty. But the difference is you won't stay stuck in confusion. You'll observe. You'll adjust. And you'll move forward. That's what separates growth from stagnation. At the end of the day, understanding people isn't about memorizing rules or techniques. It's about developing awareness. It's about paying attention to what's actually happening, not what you hope is happening. And most importantly, it's about respecting yourself enough to walk away from anything that doesn't align. Jason didn't become a different person overnight. He simply became more aware. And that awareness gave him something most men never have: clarity, control, and peace of mind. And once you have that, you don't need to chase anything. You just recognize what's right and move toward it.